The door handle was cold, under Marilyn's fingers. Behind it she could hear a young woman's voice, trembling with fear. "Please no, I don't want to." What Marilyn did in the next 60 seconds would end a powerful man's career, cost her roles worth millions, and start a movement that Hollywood tried desperately to silence. But first, she had to open that door. It was March 12, 1957, at MGM Studios in Culver City. Marilyn Monroe had arrived 15 minutes early for a meeting with director George Cukor about a potential role in a new film. She sat in the waiting area outside the casting offices, a narrow hallway lined with chairs where dozens of hopeful young actresses waited every day for their chance at stardom. The woman sitting next to Marilyn couldn't have been more than 19. She had that fresh-faced, hopeful look that Marilyn recognized immediately because she had worn it herself once. The girl's hands were shaking as she clutched a worn headshot, her lips moving silently as she practiced whatever lines she had prepared. "First audition?" Marilyn asked gently. The girl jumped, startled. Then her eyes went wide when she realized who was speaking to her. "Oh my God, you're Miss Monroe. I'm sorry, I didn't see. Yes, it's my first real audition. I mean, I've been to cattle calls, but this is with Mr. Hoffman, Gerald Hoffman. He's a real producer. He could actually give me a part." Marilyn felt something cold settle in her stomach at the name Gerald Hoffman, one of the most powerful producers at MGM, a man with a reputation for discovering young talent, a man who had been in the industry for 30 years and knew exactly how to use his power. "What's your name?" Marilyn asked. "Jennifer. Jennifer Walsh." The girl smiled nervously. "I came out here from Iowa 6 months ago. This is the first callback I've gotten. Mr. Hoffman's secretary said he was very interested in me for a small part in his new picture." Before Marilyn could respond, the door to Hoffman's office opened. His secretary, a middle-aged woman with a pinched expression, looked at Jennifer. "Mr. Hoffman will see you now." Jennifer stood up, smoothing her dress, trying to calm her obvious nerves. She walked into the office. The door closed behind her. Marilyn sat there, staring at that closed door, a sick feeling growing in her chest. She knew Gerald Hoffman's reputation. Everyone in Hollywood knew it, though no one talked about it openly. He discovered a new young actress every few months. They would be seen around town with him for a while, get a small part in one of his films, and then disappear. Some left the industry entirely. Others stayed but never spoke about their time with Hoffman. Marilyn knew because she had been in rooms like the one Jennifer had just entered. She had been 19 once, desperate for a chance, willing to believe that powerful men who showed interest in her talent actually cared about her talent. She had learned the hard way that for some men in this industry, young actresses weren't people. They were commodities, things to be used and discarded. She remembered a casting session when she was 21, barely starting to get noticed. A director, whose name she still couldn't say out loud, had told her that her audition would be more private than the others. She remembered sitting in his office, listening to him explain that Hollywood was about more than talent. It was about relationships, about trust, about showing you were a team player. She remembered the way her hands had shaken, the way she had smiled anyway, because smiling was what you did when you were scared but couldn't afford to show it. She had left that office with the role, and she had never felt clean again. That was over a decade ago, but the memory still made her stomach turn. She had told herself back then that it was the price of success, that everyone had to make sacrifices, that this was just how Hollywood worked. But deep down, she had known it was wrong, and she had carried the shame of it ever since, even as her star rose, even as she became one of the most famous women in the world. She tried to focus on the script she had brought to read while she waited, but she couldn't concentrate. Something felt wrong. Then she heard it. A voice from behind the closed door. Jennifer's voice. "Please, Mr. Hoffman. I just want to read for the part." Marilyn's head snapped up. Other people in the waiting area were carefully not reacting, staring at their own scripts or the floor, pretending they didn't hear anything. Another voice, muffled but clearly male. Hoffman's voice. The words weren't clear, but the tone was persuasive, insistent. Then Jennifer again, louder, more desperate. "No, please. I don't want to." Marilyn stood up. The other people in the waiting area looked at her, then quickly looked away. This wasn't their business. This was how things worked. This was Hollywood. But Marilyn walked to the door. She put her hand on the handle. "Miss Monroe," the secretary said sharply. "You can't go in there. Mr. Hoffman is conducting an audition." Marilyn turned the handle and pushed the door open. The scene inside was exactly what she had feared. Gerald Hoffman, a heavy-set man in his 50s wearing an expensive suit, had Jennifer backed against his desk. His hand was on her arm. Jennifer's face was streaked with tears, her eyes wide with fear and confusion. Both of them froze when they saw Marilyn standing in the doorway. "Get your hands off her," Marilyn said. Her voice was quiet, but it cut through the room like a knife. Hoffman stepped back from Jennifer, his expression shifting rapidly from shock to anger. "Miss Monroe, this is a private audition. You need to leave." "Jennifer," Marilyn said, ignoring him, and looking directly at the young woman. "Come here. Come with me." Jennifer looked at Hoffman, then at Marilyn, paralyzed by confusion and fear. "If you leave now," Hoffman said to Jennifer, his voice hardening, "you'll never work in this town. You understand me? I'll make sure every studio, every casting director knows that you're difficult, that you make accusations. You'll be blacklisted before you even start. And if you stay," Marilyn said, still looking at Jennifer, "he'll use you and throw you away, just like he's done to dozens of girls before you. I know. I've been where you are." Jennifer's eyes filled with fresh tears. Then, slowly, she moved away from Hoffman and walked toward Marilyn. "You're making a mistake," Hoffman said to Marilyn, his face reddening with anger. "Both of you, you have no idea what you're doing." Marilyn put her arm around Jennifer's shoulders. "I know exactly what I'm doing. I'm stopping you from hurting another young woman." "Hurting her?" Hoffman laughed, but there was no humor in it. "I was offering her a role, an opportunity. If she's too stupid or too prudish to understand how this business works, that's her problem, not mine." "No," Marilyn said, and her voice was shaking now, not with fear but with rage. "That's your problem, because I'm going to make sure everyone knows what you do in this office. I'm going to make sure every girl who walks through that door knows what kind of man you really are." Hoffman's expression changed. He took a step forward, his voice dropping to something cold and threatening. "You think anyone will believe you, Marilyn? You think anyone cares? This is Hollywood. This is how it works. How do you think you got where you are? You weren't any different than her when you started. You made the same choices. You did the same things. So don't stand there and pretend you're better than me." The words hit Marilyn like a physical blow, because part of them was true. She had been in rooms like this. She had been pressured and manipulated by powerful men who held her career in their hands. And yes, sometimes she had made choices she wasn't proud of, because she didn't know what else to do, because she was young and scared and desperate. But that didn't make it right, and it didn't mean she had to stay silent now. "You're right," Marilyn said quietly. "I did make choices I'm not proud of. I was in the same position as Jennifer, and that's exactly why I know what you're doing. That's exactly why I'm not going to let you do it to her. She walked out of the office with Jennifer, leaving Hoffman standing there, his face purple with rage. In the hallway, Jennifer was shaking so hard she could barely stand. Marilyn led her to a quiet corner, away from the other waiting actresses who were watching with wide eyes. "What just happened?" Jennifer whispered. Did I just destroy my career before it even started?" "No," Marilyn said firmly. "You just saved yourself from a man who would have destroyed you in other ways. Trust me." "But he said he'd blacklist me, that I'd never work." "He's going to try," Marilyn admitted. "But not if we don't let him." "Jennifer, I need to ask you something important. Are you willing to tell people what happened in that room? Are you willing to speak up about what he tried to do?" Jennifer looked terrified. I don't know. I mean, who would believe me? He's Gerald Hoffman. I'm nobody." "You're not nobody," Marilyn said. "And you won't be alone. I'll stand with you. But I need to know if you're willing to fight." Jennifer was silent for a long moment. Then, slowly, she nodded. What happened over the next 3 weeks would shake Hollywood to its core, but it started with something simple. Marilyn made phone calls. She reached out to every young actress she knew or had heard about who had auditioned with Gerald Hoffman. Some hung up when they heard what she was asking about. Some denied anything had happened, but some, quietly, carefully, agreed to talk. Within a week, Marilyn had found 12 women, 12 young actresses who had been in that casting room with Hoffman. Each phone call was difficult. Most of the women were terrified when they realized what Marilyn was asking. Some cried. Some got angry. Some said they had tried to forget what happened and didn't want to relive it. But when Marilyn told them about Jennifer, about walking into that office and seeing Hoffman with yet another young woman, something shifted. They realized it wasn't just about them anymore. It was about stopping a pattern that had been going on for decades. Marilyn brought them together at her house on a Sunday afternoon. She made sure the press didn't know. She had her housekeeper prepare coffee and sandwiches, creating an environment that felt safe and informal. She hired a lawyer, a woman named Ruth Eisenberg, who was one of the few female attorneys in Los Angeles, willing to take on Hollywood power players. When the women arrived, they were nervous, looking at each other with a mixture of recognition and shame. They had all been through similar experiences, but speaking about it felt like admitting to something shameful, even though they were the victims. "I want to start by saying something important," Marilyn told them once. Everyone was seated in her living room. "None of you did anything wrong. I know that's hard to believe, because I've spent years blaming myself for situations like the ones you've been through. But the truth is, Gerald Hoffman is a predator. He uses his power to exploit young women who have no power. That's not your fault. That's his crime." And then she asked each woman to tell her story. The stories were heartbreaking. Sarah, a 21-year-old from Texas, had been promised a starring role if she spent the weekend with Hoffman. When she refused, the role went to someone else, and she found herself unable to get auditions anywhere in town. Margaret, 19, from Ohio, had been assaulted in Hoffman's office and then threatened with legal action if she told anyone. Patricia, 23, had actually gotten a small role in one of Hoffman's films, but only after enduring months of his advances and finally giving in because she felt she had no choice. Each story was different in its details, but the same in its essence. Hoffman used his power to exploit young women who had no power of their own, and he had been doing it for years, protected by a system that valued his ability to make profitable films more than it cared about the women he hurt. "Why hasn't anyone stopped him before?" Jennifer asked during one of their meetings. "Because speaking up is dangerous," Ruth, the lawyer, explained. "In this industry, in this era, A woman who accuses a powerful man of misconduct is more likely to be destroyed than believed. She'll be called a liar, a troublemaker, someone who's just bitter because she didn't get the role she wanted. And even if people believe her, they'll say it's the price of doing business in Hollywood, that she should have known better, that she brought it on herself. So what can we do? Another young woman asked. We can tell the truth together, Marilyn said. One woman's word against Gerald Hoffman won't be enough. But 12 women, all telling similar stories, that's harder to dismiss. But it's still risky, Ruth warned. All of you need to understand what you're signing up for. This will be public. Your names will be in the papers. People will say terrible things about you. Some of them will call you liars or attention seekers. And there's no guarantee we'll win. The room fell silent. Each woman was doing the calculation. Was justice worth the cost? Was protecting other women worth potentially destroying their own careers? It was Jennifer who spoke first. I'm in. If I don't do this, he'll do it to someone else, and I won't be able to live with myself knowing I could have stopped it. One by one, the others agreed. They would come forward. They would tell their stories. They would demand accountability. Getting the story published was its own battle. Most newspapers and magazines refused to run it. They didn't want to anger MGM or risk being sued by Hoffman. But finally, Confidential magazine, known for exposing Hollywood scandals, agreed to publish a detailed article featuring the accounts of all 12 women, plus Marilyn's own statement about what she had witnessed. The article ran on April 15, 1957. The headline was explosive: Hollywood's Open Secret: How Gerald Hoffman Used His Power to Abuse Young Actresses for Decades. The reaction was immediate and divided. Some people were outraged at Hoffman and demanded he be held accountable. Letters poured into MGM demanding his termination. Several prominent actresses, inspired by Marilyn's courage, released statements supporting the women who had come forward. But the backlash was brutal. Gossip columnists, many of whom had been fed stories by studio publicists for years, ran vicious pieces questioning the women's motives. Hedda Hopper wrote that the accusations were a coordinated attempt by failed actresses to destroy a respected producer. Luella Parsons suggested that Marilyn was suffering from mental instability and projecting her own issues onto innocent situations. The worst attacks came in anonymous letters and phone calls. The 12 women who had come forward received death threats. They were called whores, liars, attention seekers. Jennifer had to change her phone number 3 times. Sarah was recognized on the street and spat on by a woman who said she was destroying Hollywood. Some suggested that Marilyn was behind it all because she was difficult and unstable and wanted attention. Industry insiders whispered that she was impossible to work with, that this was just another example of her causing problems. A prominent director told Variety that Marilyn was trying to burn down the industry that made her a star. The attacks on the women's character were systematic and coordinated. Hoffman's lawyers released statements suggesting that several of the women had willingly engaged in relationships with him and were now lying about it for financial gain. They dug into the women's pasts, looking for anything that could be used to discredit them. One woman's high school shoplifting arrest was leaked to the press. Another's previous relationship with a married man became tabloid fodder. But Marilyn and Ruth Eisenberg fought back. They held a press conference where all 12 women sat together, showing a united front. Marilyn spoke about the pattern of abuse, about how the industry protected powerful men at the expense of vulnerable women. Ruth presented documentation, including call sheets showing the frequency of Hoffman's private auditions with young actresses and statements from studio employees who had witnessed inappropriate behavior but been told to keep quiet. But something else happened too. More women started coming forward, not just women who had experienced abuse from Hoffman, but women who had similar stories about other producers, directors, and executives. The article had opened a floodgate, and suddenly women across Hollywood were whispering to each other, finding the courage to share stories they had kept secret for years. MGM initially stood by Hoffman. They released a statement calling the accusations unfounded attacks on a respected member of the film community. But as more women came forward, as the evidence mounted, as the public pressure grew, the studio's position became untenable. 6 weeks after the article was published, MGM quietly terminated Gerald Hoffman's contract. The official statement said it was a mutual decision, and that Hoffman was pursuing other opportunities. But everyone knew the truth. He had been fired. His career in Hollywood was over. But the victory came at a cost. Marilyn, who had been the driving force behind exposing Hoffman, found herself suddenly persona non grata at several studios. Projects she had been attached to fell through. A starring role in a Billy Wilder film that had been all but confirmed suddenly went to another actress. 2 other directors she had been in talks with stopped returning her calls. Her phone stopped ringing. "They're punishing you," her agent told her during a tense meeting. "Fox is furious. MGM won't touch you." Warner Brothers passed on that romantic comedy specifically because of this situation. "The studios are making an example out of you. They're showing other actresses what happens when you challenge the system." The financial impact was significant. Marilyn calculated that she had lost approximately $2 million in potential earnings from the roles that had evaporated. For an actress whose career had been built on her ability to be marketable, likable, unthreatening, this was devastating. There were other costs too. Some of her so-called friends in the industry stopped calling. Invitations to industry parties dried up. Directors she had worked with before suddenly had scheduling conflicts. Even some of her co-stars from previous films distanced themselves, afraid that association with her might damage their own careers. "Let them," Marilyn said, though her voice cracked slightly. "I'd rather lose roles than my integrity." But it hurt. Of course, it hurt. Marilyn loved acting. She loved being on set, creating characters, telling stories. She loved the craft of performance, the collaboration with directors and fellow actors, and watching opportunities slip away because she had dared to protect young women from a predator was painful in ways she hadn't fully anticipated. Some nights, alone in her house, she wondered if she had made the right choice. She thought about the roles she wouldn't play, the films she wouldn't make, the career trajectory that had been permanently altered. But then she would think about Jennifer in that office, terrified and trapped. She would think about the 12 women who had found the courage to speak their truth. And she knew that even if it cost her everything, she couldn't have made a different choice. The young women who had come forward faced their own consequences. Some found it impossible to get auditions. Others were labeled as troublemakers. A few left Hollywood entirely, deciding that an industry that protected abusers more than it protected victims wasn't worth fighting for. But not all the consequences were negative. The Screen Actors Guild, pressured by the publicity and by Marilyn's advocacy, created new guidelines for auditions and casting sessions. They mandated that actresses had the right to have someone else present during private auditions. They established a confidential reporting system for harassment and assault. They began slowly and imperfectly to acknowledge that the casting couch culture was not just distasteful but destructive. Several studios, concerned about their public image, implemented similar policies. It wasn't revolutionary change. It wasn't even adequate, but it was a start. It was acknowledgement that something needed to change. For Jennifer Walsh and the other women who had come forward, there was a different kind of victory. They had told their truth. They had been believed by enough people that it mattered, and they had stopped Gerald Hoffman from hurting anyone else. I still wonder sometimes if it was worth it. Jennifer told Marilyn a year later. They had stayed in touch, meeting occasionally for coffee or lunch. Jennifer had left acting and was working as a secretary while taking night classes in business. I mean, I gave up my dream of being an actress. But I also know that if I had stayed in that room with Hoffman that day, I would have lost something else, something more important than a career. You would have lost yourself, Marilyn said quietly. Trust me, I know what that feels like. The story of what became known as the Hoffman case faded from headlines within a few months. Hollywood moved on to other scandals, other stories, but the women who had been part of it carried it with them forever. Some of them stayed in touch, forming a support network that helped them navigate the aftermath. Others moved on with their lives, grateful to have survived but wanting to leave it all behind. For Marilyn, the experience crystallized something she had been feeling for years. She was tired of being just an actress. She wanted to use her fame and her platform for something more. She began speaking more openly about the exploitation in Hollywood, about the way young women were treated as disposable, about the need for systemic change. She also started a quiet practice of mentoring young actresses who were new to Hollywood. She would meet with them, tell them what to watch out for, explain which men to avoid, teach them that they didn't have to trade their dignity for opportunity. It wasn't formal or organized. It was just Marilyn, using her experience and her hard-won wisdom to protect women who reminded her of her younger self. Years later, after Marilyn's death, Jennifer Walsh was interviewed for a documentary about Hollywood in the 1950s. She told the story of what had happened in Hoffman's office and what Marilyn had done. She saved me that day, Jennifer said, tears in her eyes, not just from Hoffman, but from believing that I deserved to be treated that way. She showed me that I had value beyond what some powerful man decided I was worth. And she taught me that sometimes the right thing to do is also the hardest thing to do. The documentary ended with footage of Marilyn from that era, her luminous smile, her famous beauty. But now viewers could see something else too. The courage beneath the glamour, the strength beneath the vulnerability. The woman who had been hurt but refused to let others be hurt the same way. Gerald Hoffman never worked in Hollywood again. He lived quietly in Palm Springs until his death in 1974, never publicly addressing the accusations against him, never apologizing to the women he had hurt. But the 12 women who had stood together, who had told their truth despite the cost, went on to live full lives. Not all of them stayed in entertainment. Not all of them achieved the dreams they had when they first came to Hollywood. But they had something more valuable. They had their dignity. They had the knowledge that they had stood up for themselves and for each other. And they had changed, however slightly, a system that had been broken for too long. Today, when we talk about the #Me Too movement, when we discuss the importance of believing women, when we celebrate the courage it takes to speak up about abuse and harassment, we're walking a path that Marilyn Monroe and 12 young women helped clear in 1957. They didn't end the problem. They didn't create a perfect solution. But they showed that it was possible to fight back, that powerful men could be held accountable, that women's voices, when joined together, could create change. The door that Marilyn opened that day in March 1957 wasn't just the door to Hoffman's office. It was a door to a different way of thinking about power and exploitation in Hollywood. It was a door to the understanding that silence protects abusers, and that speaking up, despite the costs, is sometimes the only way forward. Marilyn paid a price for opening that door. She lost opportunities. She faced backlash. She was labeled difficult and troublesome by an industry that preferred its women to be compliant and quiet, but she never regretted it. Someone asked me once if I would do it again. Marilyn said in an interview a few years before her death, if I would risk my career to help those young women. And I said yes, without hesitation, because some things are more important than career. Some things are more important than being liked or being successful. And protecting people who can't protect themselves is one of those things. The legacy of that day, of that choice, lives on. Every time a young actress speaks up about harassment or abuse, every time someone intervenes to stop exploitation, every time the industry takes even a small step toward accountability and justice, they're continuing the work that Marilyn started when she turned that door handle and walked into a room where a young woman needed help. If this story of courage and advocacy moved you, share it with someone who needs to know that speaking up matters, even when it's costly. Have you ever stood up for someone else, despite the risk to yourself? Let us know in the comments. And remember, silence protects abusers. Your voice joined with others can change everything.